So, welcome to this presentation on spiritual abuse and counterproductive strategies in Christian parenting and education. That's my long and tedious title. I'm no expert on this, I am a layperson, but I have reflected on this for quite a while and I have consulted some experts. I'm sure that we can reflect on this together now for a little while in a way that will be beneficial to our further conversation. First, what do we mean by spiritual abuse? Well, the word abuse can mean both misuse and maltreatment, and spiritual abuse is when harm or trauma is inflicted through spirituality. And there is a double trauma of spiritual abuse that is quite tragic. When a person's faith is instrumental in causing psychological trauma, rejection of that faith is often the consequence. How can you love what caused you harm? And many people find that when they try to heal from religious trauma, they need to distance themselves from their religion. And that is why there is a double tragedy in spiritual abuse. You're not just harming the person, you're harming that person's faith, and losing one's faith is also traumatic for those who experience it. You can talk about spiritual abuse happening in two different forms. You have abusive spirituality, that is when the content of spirituality itself causes trauma, and then you have abuse through spirituality. The spirituality might be okay, but it is used in or misused abusively in a way that causes harm. And I will give examples on both of these things. There's a person in Norway called Anders Torp. Here is a picture of him. He was a pastor's son in the NAR movement, the New Apostolic Reformation movement. That is a rather, it's a charismatic movement. And he was in a very, according to him, unhealthy, charismatic church that was quite extreme. When he reached puberty, there was a lot of emphasis on being pure, and everything that wasn't pure was dirty and demonic, and of course his hormones was then demonized. His sexual feelings, his natural sexual awakening as a teenager was demonized, and he had to fight it, and this led to exorcisms. And it's rather horrendous to hear how he described these exorcisms. There was no honorable way out of them. Either there was screaming and expectations, and either you played along and admitted that you had a demon and did what was expected, or you did not, and then it was not successful and the demon was still in you and you had to be exposed to more of this, and it was just a terrible experience for him to have to go through this as a 13-year-old young boy. When this, of course, did not quench his hormones, he heard about fasting, and he almost starved himself to death in order to gain victory. He tells of invading, controlling environment in this church, congregation being manipulated for money. And there was also an end-time fair craze that led to him being sent to a crazy end-time boot camp in Denmark, where he was literally tortured by the leaders there in an attempt to prepare him for the impending judgment that was soon, not judgment, but persecution that was soon to come upon them as soldiers of Jesus. Just terrible what he had to experience. But he has broken with his family, and he's a spokesperson for people who are breaking with unhealthy spirituality, is involved with an organization that tries to help them. And and he's often in the media, and he's like, what do you say, a watchdog, always barking, speaking up when he sees unhealthy religion. And he's participating in debates about this, giving very constructive contributions. And he says, that any religion that teaches the eternal torture of the lost in hell is by nature abusive. The whole thing that drove all these sick things that happened in his church was the fear of hell that could justify anything, and it drove lots of these crazy things that happened. And he will say that if an organization teaches eternal torment in hell, then that organization is abusive to children. It's causing traumatic fear in children, and should not be accepted as a healthy organization. That's his opinion. The content of the faith is in itself abusive. Another friend of mine, Anders Torp is not a friend, I have never met him. I hope he will be my friend, but a friend of mine, a former pastor, he took a break from his pastoral ministry when he came out as gay, and he started studying again, and he took a job. He volunteered at a hotline for young people who were struggling with their sexuality. And he says he's still a fervent Christian, and he says it was like all the Christians were suddenly directed to me because they knew that I could understand them. And he had to listen to stories upon stories upon stories on what these young people had to go through as they realized, many of them, to their horror, that they had the same sex attractions. And they knew, of course, their church positions on this. And he later wrote a master thesis on this, interviewing 10 Adventists who had grown up Adventist and who came out as gay. And he will say that this doctrine here, it's of course not a doctrine, but it's many people speak as if this is true. Same-sex attraction is sinful, shameful. And through no fault of their own, these young people experience that they have same-sex attractions. They fight it. It leads to years of self-hate and shame, and many of them have been on the verge of suicide. Some even do kill themselves. And this is another example of how a content in someone's spirituality, and of course the Adventist Church does not teach this, but this impression is often given in conservative Christian circles, that same-sex attraction is something really shameful and sinful. And this has led to so much trauma and broken relationships and even suicides. Maybe a little less serious example came from a megachurch in Oslo. It was this text from 1 Thessalonians that we read in funerals: "Do not grieve like the rest who do not have hope." And of course, hope helps when we grieve. But among some of these people in this church, they told later that it had been kind of like a fad, something spiritual thing, that they shouldn't express grief when loved ones died, because they had gone on to be with Jesus, they believed. And that was so much better, and why should they grieve this? And it somehow short-circuited their natural grief response. Because even though we have hope, we still miss them just as much as to anyone else. They're gone, and we don't have them in our life anymore. And when they were with their good friends from church, they couldn't talk about how they really felt. They had to pretend that they didn't grieve like the rest, because it was kind of unspiritual to grieve that someone had gone to be with Jesus. These are examples of abusive spirituality. Let's bring it a bit closer to home and talk about things that we expose our children to. And the first thing I would talk about is fear. We should be very careful about what we tell our children. Causing fear in children is generally defined as psychological violence. And some countries have laws to protect children against it. And causing fear through religious teaching may also constitute a form of spiritual abuse that may cause lifelong damage. And it might be things like hell, eternal damnation, judgment. Many of us had these horrendous dreams as children that Jesus came back, and either we or our parents was not brought along to heaven. And to be separated from those that we love was a traumatic thing in these dreams. We may teach that you have to believe in Jesus to be saved. And what if a child has a father who is an unbeliever or a mother who is an unbeliever? What are we teaching them? We are instilling this tremendous fear of being separated from the ones they love. And the concept of Jesus' return is anything but a joyful message. And we should think about this thing. Imminent end-time testing and persecution. Some people are able to abstract, and you just think that, these are images of what might happen. But some people take it quite literally, and it causes fear, traumatic fear. And of course, talk of Satan, demons, evil angels, evil spirits can cause a lot of fear in children and even adults and youth. We should think about how and when we teach about such concepts. Another thing is the either or kind of thinking that accompanies this very strong focus on Satan and the devil. Things like the whole world is under Satan. If you're not holy with Jesus, you belong to the devil. Is it Jesus or Satan who rejoices when you act like that? If Jesus isn't Lord of all, he isn't Lord at all. And language that consistently paints the world in good and evil, either or, may have some unwanted effects. And firstly, it may cause a child to fear their own questions and doubts in a way that hinders healthy inner growth. If I question this, if I don't agree, I place myself on the dark side. I become one of those that mom, dad, or the church rejects. And such fears may shut down important conversations. And it may lead to that they don't open up. They don't talk about the things they're struggling with for fear of being labeled on the side of Satan, for fearing that they are now giving in to the dark side or become one of those that the church rejects. And they may even shut down their own thoughts and doubts in a very unhealthy way when this language is used. And again, I believe many Christians fear Satan more than they fear God, and I think Satan really rejoices at that. You can't go bowling because Satan is in the music that is played there. When children are taught to look for Satan everywhere, that's not healthy. It's not conducive to healthy development. One more example, and this might surprise, it surprised me. I hadn't included it, but I talked to a psychiatrist who thought I should. And it's this thought that when obedience is taught as a religious virtue, it might have some very strange results. I will talk about that. But, we might say something, you saw what happened to Adam and Eve when they disobeyed. Or, it's Satan who is behind every rebellious spirit. You are aware that what God told Moses should happen to disobedient children. I hope none of us have ever said this to our children. But as an adult, I've had the middle one thrown at me. And the thing is that children who has internalized that adults should be blindly obeyed for obedience sake are more exposed to abuse. Adults who know how to exploit other people's faith to get their way may harm both them and their faith. And children should instead learn that they can expect respect also when saying no. We should practice with our children saying no or stop if they should experience something that is not right. We should teach them that they can always let us know also if other adults cross their boundaries. We should affirm them when they tell us about negative experiences. And we should let them experience that it is safe to express their opinion and that it's unnecessary to scream or get mad in order to be heard. And we should be happy when they display the ability to think for themselves, as the last thing we would like is for our children to become uncritical followers of those with most power or charisma. And incidentally, God's closest friends in the Bible were those who argued with him the most. And we have people like Abraham and David and others, Lot. What we and God wants is trust and respect, not blind obedience. And we will instill respect when we ourselves model respect towards the child by not overwhelming or manipulating them, but instead challenging them friendly, age-appropriately, lovingly, curiously, and respectfully, and give them space and freedom to shape their own opinions and to make their own choices within safe limits. And trust is something we earn by being constantly trustworthy ourselves. So, to use God to instill obedience in our children may not be wise. Even to just insist on blind obedience because we are parents and they are children is not necessarily wise. So here we cross over in a way from abusive spirituality through abuse through spirituality. Using spirituality abusively. And I will give one strong example of this, and that is shame. Shaming is never a good strategy, because shame targets the whole person, not just the action. And the implied message is, what kind of person are you? There must be something fundamentally wrong with you. And some countries have laws to protect children from receiving such verbal abuse. And in our setting, it might be something like, now the angels are crying. Or, Jesus must be so disappointed in you now. Or, do you really think anyone behaving like that belongs in heaven? Now, this is abuse in and of itself, but it is also abuse through spirituality. And it's abuse of spirituality. Because Jesus was not about shaming people. He was quite to the contrary. He took people's shame away from people. And he built them up and taught them their value, not their things that, not that there was something fundamentally wrong with them, but that there was something fundamentally good with everyone. And so when we say things like this, we are misrepresenting Jesus in a way that is not healthy. And it causes a double damage. It harms the child, and it harms his or her faith. Early associations established between faith and shame may later make it necessary for some to distance themselves from faith altogether in order to live a good life. And we should instead focus on developing our child's feeling of self-worth and self-esteem. One more example. It's about reversing the roles. It might happen through statements like this. Do you think God is happy when you behave like that? Do you really want to make Jesus sad? Do you think God is angry or happy when you behave like that? Now, if you were not to use God here, but use yourself or your spouse, this would be a reversing of the roles. You are making the child responsible for the emotional well-being of the adults. And that is not a healthy environment for the children to tiptoe around and feel guilty for not making his or her parents happy all the time. It's not safe for children to grow up like that. And when we do this with God, and we make God into this unstable, moody person, it's really not wise at all. To hold a child responsible for God's negative feelings or absent of positive feelings is just unwise, because it portrays God as needy, moody, unstable, dependent upon our perfect performance, instead of being the strong and safe Father who will always be there for us, even in our worst moments. So, again, statements like this, causing a double harm, creates an unsafe environment, because we are using God in a manipulative way that makes the children responsible for God's mood. And of course, if that experience becomes a trauma, then it also harms the child's ability to have a positive spirituality later in life. And we could also mention here undue manipulation and control, using spirituality to gain power, or exploiting spiritual authority for money or sex, which is also extremely harmful in and of itself, but it also harms a person's faith, person's ability to have a healthy spirituality later. One more example could be abuse of spirituality. This might not harm the child as much as it harms their spirituality. Jesus doesn't want us to, the 10 Commandments says not to, or Ellen White says. And what we do here is we are using someone else's authority to induce guilt. And Jesus becomes the one, not the solution to guilt, but the one who heaps guilt upon us. Now, I would say that actions are wrong when they damage people and relationships and cause suffering and grief. And actions are good and right when they repair, reduce, or do not contribute to suffering and grief. It is not Jesus, but it is our actions that generate guilt. And we should present Jesus as a solution to guilt and not the cause of it. And the implied message here, when we use this tactic, is that if Jesus, God, wasn't there with his rules and his punishment, maybe the behavior would be acceptable. Why do we need Jesus to tell our children that they shouldn't hit their brother or sister? We don't. And we might inadvertently teach our children to not think ethically, but just rely on authority, which incidentally is a psychopathic way of thinking. So, finally, what should be the guiding principle? Karsten Hjort Pedersen has written this book, Influence with Respect. And this sentence says so much: influence with respect. Amazon writes this about the book: whenever we interact with other people, we influence them, and they influence us. Within this sphere, neutrality is an impossibility. Instead, we must learn to think in terms of good and bad ways of influencing. And here the key word is respect. The need for respectful influence is no less critical when dealing with religious influence, especially in the relationship between children and adults. In this book, longtime director of the Christian Institute of Education in Denmark, Karsten Hjort Pedersen provides valuable guidance for parents, educators, teachers, club leaders, and preachers who influence others in work or leisure. In a language accessible to all readers, the author shows the way to a healthy balance, a balance that relies on the will to confront, but without letting down the other person, neither through intimidation nor desertion. And what he means by this is that there is a continuum of influence. And one is that we give up to influence and we withdraw. We abandon our responsibility. We choose non-engagement. And that, the interesting thing is that children who has parents who have chosen this strategy, the children do not know what the parents believe. They have never heard any strong opinions from their parents. They have been taught that maybe their parents are indifferent. They struggle just as much as those who have had an undue manipulative influence. We should not abandon our responsibility to influence. But neither should we go the way of intimidation. And those are the examples I have given in this presentation, where we frighten, overwhelm, or manipulate the child or the youth. And between the healthy respect and the intimidation, there is some back and forward movements of confrontation and retreat when we realize that we have gone too close. And that is what this respect is all about. Respect means to hold in high regard. And I leave you with this thought that children are human beings. Children are not human becomings, but human beings with the same basic human rights as adults, including freedom of thoughts, conscience, and religion. They have the right to express themselves and to be heard. And therefore, influence with respect is the only healthy way in our spiritual interaction with youth and children. Thank you.